Good afternoon and good morning to those of you joining in places where it is still morning, and afternoon to others. And welcome to our session today on the Boundaries Commission report. My name is Lauren Hodson, and I am thrilled to be joined by Andrew Richardson, the chair of the Boundaries Commission. I want to welcome you, Andrew, and I want to welcome all of our participants who are logged in live. Welcome. I know we have many who are already logged in waiting for our session to begin, and others will be joining us momentarily, I'm sure. As we begin, I want to start with just a few pieces of housekeeping. So let you know that this is meant to be a participatory session. We want to hear from you. So there is a chat box next to your YouTube video screen, and we will be monitoring questions in this chat box throughout our session today. So please be typing in your questions that you have for Andrew. We're going to try and get to as many questions as we can. And all the questions that are input into the chat box as well as sent by email will be answered, if not today, by this session at a later point through the email. So the email is remits@united-church.ca. And in addition to fabulous folks who are monitoring our chat box, we also have people monitoring the email. And this email, any questions that aren't answered today in this session will be answered at a later point. So please make note of this address. If there are any questions that for you come out of this session, any follow-up, that is a place where you can send those comments and questions. We also have Michelle, who is with us monitoring our chat for any questions in French today. So please, if you would like to offer a question in French, that is welcome. And we have Michelle translating. So thanks to Michelle. So I think that's all the housekeeping for me. Oh, actually, no, it's not. One last piece, which is that to type questions into our YouTube chat box, you will need a YouTube account. It's a very quick thing to do. So if you're getting a message on the chat box right now that says you need to enable an account, you just go and do that. It's very simple. And then you'll be able to type in your questions and participate that way. So that is all the housekeeping. If you have any issues and need help, you can offer that in the chat and we'll make sure that everyone is able to participate. So I want to turn things over to our guest today, Andrew Richardson. Welcome, Andrew. We are so glad that you're here. Andrew is joining us from his office in Summerside, PEI, and Andrew was the chair of the Boundaries Commission, along with 8 other volunteers from across the church. So, Andrew, welcome.
Great, thank you, Lauren. I'm looking forward to being in conversation with folks around our work.
Fabulous. We're so glad that you're here. So to start us off, Andrew, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about the history of this work.
Sure. We have been talking about change to this model more or less for about 10 years. So this is really coming to the end of it. And we received our mandate for the commission from General Council. So we were a commission, we were a decision-making body. The mandate, the timeline, and the members were all decided by General Council.
And so while this is a new group of people, the group of you on the commission, this is in no way a new task, so to say.
Exactly. So, and I will say that the boundary piece is really the first of the final implementation of this 10-year conversation.
So you've mentioned your mandate, and there were 2 things in the mandate that the commission had. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about the specifics of that mandate.
Sure. We had 2, and Stephen, maybe you put the slide up. We had 2 parts to our mandate, really, 2 tasks. One was to establish the number of regional councils, and one was to determine their boundaries. Those are the only 2 things we were tasked with. And just to be clear, staffing, how the councils would be resourced financially, that is the job of the REMIT implementation team. That was not part of our mandate. So we set about figuring out a way to do just those 2 things.
Okay, and the REMIT implementation team is a separate team from the Boundaries Commission.
That's right, and so they were waiting to hear from us how many regions there would be, and where the boundaries would be, and then they could immediately launch into their work.
So how did you go about this task without considerations of things such as finances and staffing?
Yeah, so one of the first things that we did was we reminded ourselves that we were wanting to have a picture for the whole church, and that the main thing that we wanted to be able to do at the end of this was have regional councils that would work and be able to carry out their mandate and their ministry. And so we needed to consult with the church widely. We had a very limited amount of time to do that. And so we sent members of our commission to every conference, and we deliberately sent people who were not from that conference or didn't have any experience with that conference in order to get some fresh ears. And they met with conference executive. We had a bit of a process. We had an opportunity to ask some questions around criteria and the kinds of things that they were looking for. And then we had written submissions from conferences, from presbyteries, from individuals, from French ministries, from Indigenous communities, and from some of our ministry agencies.
So extensive consultation, absolutely, in a short period of time, because your commission was kind of mandated coming out of the reconvening of General Council in September 2017. Is that correct?
Yes, and so there was a fair amount of information for us to sift through and seek the best wisdom that was already out there. I mean, the advantage we had is that people have been talking about this for a while, so we didn't spring it on them.
Yeah.
And so we were able to collate and get a pretty good sense, I think, about how people were thinking about this new entities that they were moving into. And so then, sorry.
Yeah, so then you took all of this feedback from this extensive consultation, and then how did you go about discerning from that? I understand that you had 4 criteria that you used then to move into what you might propose.
Right. So we had to distill this wisdom down in some way. We had to have some kind of way of looking at it, and so we chose 4. And these were things that we heard directly from our consultation. So the first and most obvious was geography, that the regional councils should have some intuitive, logical sense that we would take into account travel patterns, population size, density, political boundaries, that sort of thing. Then relationships, we heard loud and clear at every level that there was a desire to continue to be in relationship and the importance that was put on relationships. And so we tried to maintain connections among the communities of faith. Some would be a continuity of relationships. Others would be perhaps rearranging into some more logical relationships. Then we had capacity, and by capacity we meant simply that each region would have the human resources and the ability to do the work of the regional councils and to make effective decisions. And then finally, what we called culture, that is, the regional councils should be bound together in some way by a common language, a common theology, some historical relationships, and that they be balanced out in some way, rural and urban.
So I imagine using these 4 criteria was an incredibly helpful tool. And I imagine that you heard a variety of different things coming out of these consultations. But I also wonder, were there some themes or threads that you heard that were consistent across the church that came out of the consultations?
Yeah, we heard first and foremost, we heard the need for importance of relationships. That the regional council, because we're moving from, and we've been focusing on regions, but really we're moving from 98 courts to 17. So the relationships matter, and then related to that was the importance of the size, that the size should be kind of an interim size between a conference and a presbytery, and allow those relationships to continue. And then we also heard sort of competing views of change. Some people, everybody recognized we were moving into change. Some people wanted change, but others to go first. And then most people said they wanted this change to be transformative.
Mm-hmm.
That since we are changing, we're committed to the change, it ought to be something that changes how we do things and really helps us move into the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is really helpful to hear. I'm wondering, I see we have lots of questions already starting to come in, lots of questions around kind of the specifics of how the boundaries have been proposed. So we're going to jump into that in a moment. But first, I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about the Indigenous Church. I know that in your report, there is a section on the Indigenous Church. And can you speak a bit about how your commission went about looking at the relationship with the Indigenous Church and the boundaries?
Sure. Early on, we had a letter from the caretakers of our United Church, which is a group representing Indigenous congregations and ministry, and they were very clear that they were requesting that they be left out of this process.
Hmm.
Very much in line with the calls to the church document that was sent to the executive of General Council. And the intent of that was that once they got a look at the regional councils, they would determine then what their relationship with those regional councils was going to be. So they didn't want the commission to do that for them.
Hmm.
And so we happily agreed with that. And that was really our first decision, was to concur with that. So on the map, Indigenous churches are in gray, and that simply means that shows you where they are, but that currently their relationship with any particular region is unknown.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and so you've just mentioned the map, and I just want to draw folks' attention to the GIS map, which is a phenomenal resource, and it shows very clearly the boundaries and also the division of each pastoral charge, each congregation, into the proposed boundaries that your commission has proposed, and then also the gray dots for Indigenous churches. So that's a really helpful resource that if folks haven't already, I would commend to you to check out, and we'll plug that again throughout our time together. So we have questions coming in. You just spoke a bit in terms of the criteria that your group used. You spoke about the idea of balancing of rural and urban. And so one of the questions that we've had come in asks, does that mean that you tried to have both urban and rural communities in each region? What were your discussions around that?
Sure. So this whole thing about urban and rural can work both ways, right? I mean, sometimes rural, non-urban congregations worry about being subsumed by an urban center, and then urban centers sometimes feel they have nothing in common, perhaps with rural congregations. And so, what we did was try to ensure that there was some urban-rural mix in most of the regional councils,
Okay.
as geography would allow.
Okay. So we have had a number of questions already from folks in BC wondering why the commission proposed the division of BC into two regions. Can you speak a bit about that question?
Sure, and you'll notice it's not just BC that was divided into more than one region. We had a number of former conferences divided, and we worked from the criteria out to the number. So even the number 17 surprised even perhaps the commission in some ways. One of the things, again, one of the things we heard loud and clear was that people wanted something that was a workable size. And so we looked at ways where we could reduce the size of conferences, keeping in mind that we wanted to maintain some capacity to do the work. So, for example, Saskatchewan is the same. And the reason for that is they have a lot of smaller rural charges, 3/4 ministry time. And so the capacity wasn't there to divide. In British Columbia's case, we felt that there might be an opportunity for kind of an interior British Columbia region, which would have commonalities in culture and geography, and then there would be a coastal Vancouver kind of centered part of the conference, and so that's primarily what drove it.
So I mean, really referring back to those criteria that you mentioned at the beginning around relationship.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And wanting I mean, perhaps the easiest thing for us to have done would have been just to take the 13 conferences that we had and say, okay, now your regions.
Yeah.
But there was not there was a desire to try something new and to see if something new would work.
And a lot of people asking questions around kind of the specifics of how the recommendations evolved. And then in line with what you've just said, we have one person who says that they're excited to see 2 regions in BC, and wondering, will this ensure that the region will not simply become the same as BC Conference, and will it work? And their comment said, might be worth a try. So I'm really hearing that sense that you mentioned coming out of the consultations, that people seemed from your consultations ready for change and kind of longing for something transformative.
Yes, and I think in BC's case, for example, the interior of British Columbia is a unique culture. And those churches perhaps have opportunity now to develop their own theology that's reflective of their own place.
So similar question coming out of the Maritimes. Can you speak a bit about the Maritimes and the changes there and what's being recommended?
Sure. So the Maritimes are used to being one group of church folk. And I think some were surprised that there were 2 regions. But again, the same reasons apply. We're trying to create regional councils that were manageable, both that they were able to maintain relationships, but also be manageable from a human resource point of view, right? I mean, these regional councils are going to have substantial work. We want to limit travel where we can, and we want to enable congregations to be in contact with each other so that they can share the workload in a manageable way.
That's helpful. So there's lots of just continuing to monitor, lots of questions. We're going to continue getting into the specifics, but it might be helpful here, Andrew, if you just speak a bit about the process going forward. So your commission's report is proposing the 17 boundaries. Is this the be all end all? Is this the final recommendation? Can you talk a bit about what happens between now and January 31st and then going forward from there?
Sure. All of the documentation that shows our work shows it as an interim report, and it's meant to be exactly that. We believe that this is the result of our best work and our faithful deliberations, but we're into a kind of testing period where we put it out there, and people have a chance now to have a good look at it and say, okay, we see your point, but we don't think this will work. And our agenda really is to have workable regional councils. So if there are areas where the people are saying, no, this is never going to work, you got the geography wrong, you got the context wrong, and they have a motion coming from either a conference, a presbytery, or a pastoral charge suggesting a change, then we will weigh that. Now, that is not to say that every request is going to be changed, but it is to say the end goal here is to have workable regional councils on the ground that are ready and able to go. And Steve, if we could have that email slide up.
Awesome.
You'll see 2 emails. So the remit one is one that's monitored widely by the implementation team. And if you have general questions about how things might function or staffing or something like that, then send your request to that box. The second email is the one that we're concerned with, and that's for changes, proposed changes. And I will say that what will be most helpful to us are to be as concrete as possible and to say the change that you'd like to propose, and then some concrete reasons why. And then we have until January 31st, I think, for that. And yes, that is a very crunched timeline. I've heard lots of complaints about that. That timeline was the one given to us, and it's simply a reminder that we have a lot of work to do to get all of this implemented. And so we're under pressure here. And so after January 31st, the Commission will reconvene. We'll go through the proposed changes and the ones that speak to us and make some sense to us, then we will adjust accordingly.
Awesome, thank you. So reg change at united-church.ca for specifics. And just to point out that only pastoral charges, presbytery and conference executives can make those specific requests. Is that the case?
That's right. And we would need a motion from those bodies.
Okay.
We are a commission, and so we require kind of official communication in that way.
Okay, so a motion coming from a pastoral charge, presbytery, conference to make a specific change. And then the deadline for that is January 31st to get those in. And then that will all be considered going forward into the next steps of the process.
That's right.
Okay, great.
And then we will issue our final report. And
do you know when that will be?
It'll be sometime in late February or first part of March.
Okay, great. Perfect. So some timelines for folks to kind of keep on their radar. We have lots of questions coming in about staffing, and you touched upon it at the beginning that, you know, really the mandate of this committee was not to look at or not to propose recommendations regarding staffing. So questions wondering specifics like will regions and which regions might share executive secretaries, or what would the staffing models look like? So I mean, I really heard you say that the mandate of your group was to propose the number and the boundaries of the regions, and then going forward, it's the REMA implementation group that will be looking at staffing and financing.
Exactly. And let me just say one thing about staffing. All along in our consultations, when we visited with conferences and in our written confrontation, much of the material that came into us was about the implementation of the regions. So people were probably more concerned about the implementation of the regions than they were about the actual boundaries. And what we did with that material, as we heard questions around staffing, we passed that on to the implementation team.
Okay.
So for example, one of the things that we heard consistently was the need for the regions to have staffing close enough to them that they know their staff. Mm-hmm. Now, so we pass that on to the implementation team, and it will be their job now that they know there's going to be 17 regions, is to figure out how best to do that.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about the ways that our church goes about doing its work is that often we have commissions or groups doing these pieces, but they're not in silos. They're not isolated in a way that can just be fully encompassed within one group. So that communication and correspondence between the different working groups is really important, and to recognize that all of this is in relationship and in consideration with other things.
Right, and I mean, this is the first piece, and then all of our other work comes from this. So the implementation team had been working, but they really couldn't go very far without knowing how many regions there were and where they were, and so now they'll be busy determining where offices are going to be, how many offices, how many staff, etc.
Mm-hmm. So there's some questions coming in about the number of regions, and so as you've said, the Commission has proposed 17 regions, and for some of the comments are, you know, it's interesting, are saying there's a surprise here with this being more than the current number of conferences. For others, commenting. And you've mentioned it as well, that's a big change from when we think of our current number of presbyteries and conferences to 17. And so, I mean, there's questions, some folks saying this feels like a decrease, others saying it feels like an increase from what they were anticipating. I imagine that some of those types of comments came into your group as well, and kind of the balance, how you talked about that, a bit more detail, if you could give us about how you talked about that.
Sure. So we didn't, it was interesting because we didn't start with numbers. We started with the ministry of and the mandate for the regional councils.
Mm-hmm.
We started with the 4 criteria that we had,
Mm-hmm.
and then we kind of moved across the country, looking at using the matrix of the criteria, the 4 of them together, overlaying them on each particular region, and saying what does this area need in order to do the ministry of the regional council. One of the things that I've been hearing quite a bit is that this whole exercise of change was primarily about cost cutting.
Mm.
And some people have said the 17 regions will increase our costs. I don't know whether it will or it won't, but what I can say is that our concern and our mandate was to make workable regional councils.
Right.
It was not our job to reduce so that we could save money.
Mm-hmm. And part of that consideration, as you've said, was the number of pastoral charges of congregations in each regional council. And so we've had some questions around kind of there is a discrepancy in terms of the size, the number of communities in each. Can you talk a bit about that? We have some questions coming in about some of those discrepancies.
Sure. So the real thing that we considered was not so much the number of pastoral charges, but the capacity in each region. So some regional councils will have more pastoral charges than others, but some of those numbers might be small, 3/4 time, half time pastoral charges, whereas in others they might be larger, more sustainable. So that's what we were looking at, not numbers so much, but the capacity to do the work.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question from Alberta folks wondering about, and I mean, I think I'm really sensing a trend in kind of this approach that your group brought to looking at these criteria. But can you speak a bit more about the specifics of some of the considerations when looking at Alberta? And whereas in BC, the split is north-south, in Alberta, it's east-west.
Sure. So in Alberta, when we looked at making 2 regional councils from one former conference, the natural division in Alberta seemed to be around the 2 major cities. So each of the cities, Edmonton and Calgary, are kind of anchoring a regional council. In British Columbia, the separation was the mountains, so it was more geographical to do it that way. And so that's really the reason why one's north-south and one's east-west.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you. A question regarding kind of process going forward and the fact that our basis of union, the United Church of Canada Act, is an act of parliament. Someone is asking, does this change that's being proposed have to be accepted by parliament?
I'm not really sure about that. And again, that really didn't fall under our mandate. I'm assuming if it does, it'll be taken care of. And if it doesn't, we'll move forward.
My understanding coming out of General Council in Corner Brook in 2015 was that the way that changes were recommended would not need to be a change to an act of parliament, but would have implications to the basis of union, which then required the remit category that this process has gone through. So that's my understanding, but hopefully folks who are monitoring, if there's different understandings, can maybe give me a comment. So question regarding consultation specifically. We have a number of questions, more questions from BC folks, asking specifically about the scope of the consultation. So kind of a sense that what was proposed was maybe different from what the consultation with BC Conference Executive, what emerged from that, and what other considerations were taken that influenced what was recommended.
Yeah, sure. So we gave weight to all of the various levels of consultation that we had, and at no point did we say that even as we listened to folks and as people gave us their best wisdom, that was what was going to be part of our final recommendations. So we did hear discrepancies in every region, people proposing at a pastoral charge level something different than the executive, people at a presbytery level proposing something specific, et cetera, et cetera. So we tried to weave all that together and come up with something that made sense. And we tried to keep every region as part of the whole. So as we began to realize that we might very well have more regions than we anticipated, then we began to think about every area as a potential smaller, making a couple of smaller regions. So everything plays against everything, and our group is thinking about the whole rather than just each individual place.
And so again, reiterating the fact that this report from the Boundaries Commission is one step of an ongoing process, and really encouraging now the next step is putting this back out to the church, seeking further feedback through making recommendations, specific recommendations. There have been questions coming in about the tight timeline, and you mentioned for response, you mentioned that you had heard that as well. Some folks saying, what if their presbytery executive, say, is not meeting between last week and January 31st? My sense is that, well, actually, did you folks talk about that?
I'll be frank. That we felt under pressure because of the timeline. It would be great to have a longer period of consultation. We simply don't have that time. We have to be moving into full implementation by January the 1st. So that's less than a year away. And so there are some pieces that have to be put in place. Now, having said that, there's no reason that a presbytery, a pastoral charge, or a conference executive can't call a special meeting. And there's lots of ways to do that. It doesn't have to be in person necessarily, and to deal with a major concern.
Okay, thank you. Wondering, Andrew, if you could address the size of Region 7. We have quite a few questions coming in about Region 7, and what is the rationale for separating from Manitoba?
Sure. 7 is a very stretched out region. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And one of the realities in Canadian geography is distance. What we felt was that there's enough large centers in that area, along with the rural pastoral charges, that would give that area a really good capacity. And we do think that those people who live there are used to traveling in that general area, that they be able to get to one another, perhaps in the middle of the region when need be. And they have enough similarity, cultural similarity and geographical similarity, that part of it will give them the capacity that they need. It is big. It's a big country.
Yeah, absolutely. Returning back to something we spoke a bit about at the beginning regarding the consultation and process with Indigenous churches. We have some questions, a number of questions it looks like, wondering about on the GIS map, communities that are listed with those gray dots. One comment saying, why were Indigenous and non-Indigenous pastoral charges labeled as gray? Why was the default Indigenous? My sense is, as you said at the beginning, your group, and from the very beginning, spoke with the caretakers, and that the request was that Indigenous churches have their own process for then looking at how to relate and be in relationship with what moves forward.
Right. So just to be clear, we weren't trying to dodge something or not deal with something. Those churches have that gray designation on their own request of the Indigenous folk, and partly it's to get away from this kind of colonial understanding where the colonial church decides for other people, and so these Indigenous churches are very conscious of that. They're wanting to move into a new kind of relationship with the whole church and how we do all things. And so this is just consistent with that. And we felt it very importantly to honor that request early.
Okay, great. Thank you. Apologies, we're jumping a little bit all over the place here, but we have a great variety of questions coming in. It's phenomenal. In terms of next steps, and once your group puts out a final report, and then those recommendations being in part of the consideration of the REMIT implementation team. Questions wondering, will the REMIT implementation team hold one of these Q&A online meetings? And we already have a response from them saying that there is already regular communications through the REMIT implementation team's newsletter. So if folks want to be privy to that, you can sign up for that newsletter, and a response from the REMIT implementation folks that they would be happy to hold a webinar like this, likely in the fall, when decisions have then been passed by General Council 43. So again, highlighting the fact that this is one of many steps in an ongoing process of change and transformation in the church.
Right, and I think it bears repeating that it's not business as usual. That this is and the regional boundaries are just a tip of it. We're headed for some very, very different ways of doing things in the church. Lots of us think that there's opportunity in that, but nevertheless, it's a shock to the system.
Yeah.
And we're going to see that very quickly now as meat gets on the bones here, and we learn not only where we are, our pastoral charges are in terms of a particular region, but also how those regions are going to be staffed, what kind of money there's going to be, and so on.
Yeah. So lots more considerations
there's lots more change to come.
Yeah. We have a question from Trish McGregor. Trish says, I have youth and young adults who are concerned about the changes. They've been very involved in our conferences, and now with new regions coming forward, what were any considerations around current programming for youth and young adults, or how youth and young adult ministries fit into some of the consultation or what you heard from your work?
Right. So we didn't hear specifically from youth or young adult population. And in some ways, this is another implementation issue. It's not just youth and young adult ministries that are in flux here. It's all of the ministries that from the conferences. And it will be up to the regional councils to determine how that gets, how the various work of a former conference gets implemented and continued in their own regional council. And I suspect that early on, that's going to be some of the conversations these regional councils have. What work is there? How do we pick it up? And so on. But really, it wasn't part of our work.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So I'm wondering if we could go back to those 4 criteria that you mentioned at the beginning, because there seems to be quite a few questions coming in about those 4 criteria, and speaking about kind of the relationship between looking at those criteria and then moving to the recommendations. And you have spoke quite a bit about this, Andrew. So, but can you give a bit more detail about how these divisions were made in relationship to geography, in relationship to relationship, and all those pieces?
So in a way, they're all interrelated. And we really didn't separate them out and use each one individually, but rather we kind of use them as a matrix, as a template to look through. And then as we made any of our decisions, we measured them against those kinds of things. So we asked ourselves, does this geography make sense to us? Does this help us, this boundary, enhance relationships? Is there within the whatever boundary we drew, is there enough human resources and financial resources to do the job of a regional council? So, for example, Newfoundland is an interesting one. Newfoundland has experience of being divided previously, and now it's one again. And the reason for that, we heard quite clearly that they did not feel they had the capacity to be smaller than a provincial region. And so we paid attention to that.
Yeah.
I will say it's possible that we I mean, our commissioners were not representative from every region. We weren't intimately familiar with the geography of every little place across the country.
Yeah.
And it may very well be that some of the geography or the divisions might not work. And that's the whole point of this interim report is to have people tell us where they know for sure it's not going to work.
Yeah. Fabulous. So I want to push you a bit more based on a question that's just come in about the culture criteria. And this question is wondering, when you were considering culture, was it church culture or overall culture of that particular region? And this person's saying, I would argue that they are different things. So
right.
So what did that consideration
That's an excellent
look like?
question.
It's a great question.
And in some ways, we considered both things. One of the things that was very clear when we visited each conference and heard back from each conference is that every conference has its own way of doing things.
Yeah.
Its own internal way of making decisions, of doing ministry, and so on. So we're a united church, and yet we're very, very different as we go across the country. Yeah. And so those are primarily it was cultural in the sense of geographical. There's a maritime culture. There's a urban culture. There's a Toronto culture, and so on. Those are the kinds of things that we primarily focused on.
And often, while different, the church cultures of those regions are influenced by
sure they are.
The overarching culture. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And they mesh together.
Yeah. So I have just been asked to ask the consistoire to please repost your question in French. So I understand the consistoire has posed a question, and I'm wondering if that could please be reposted in French, and we'll have Michelle, our translator, translate that so that we can get to that as well. I'm wondering, were there particular things that surprised you, Andrew, as you were going about this work? What surprised you most?
I think the fact that we ended up with 17 regions, to be honest. I thought most of us we were given a kind of general framework, and we thought we would be within that. But that as we begin to do our work, as we begin to kind of move across the country, some logical, to us anyway, some logical divisions began to occur. We realized we're going to probably end up with more. And we felt the smaller regional councils would get at some of the criteria we had, but also get at some of the intent of that people were saying around relationship, around ease of travel, around ability to and capacity to do the work.
Yeah. So we just have a few minutes left, but we've had a question. So along the lines of what was most surprising, one of our participants is wondering what issues were most difficult to achieve consensus on amongst the members of the commission. Were there kind of sticking points or places that were difficult to navigate?
Not really. We had I must say, we had an excellent group of commissioners who were always able to see the big picture. And so when we came to an issue that maybe was a little divisive, then we were able to kind of work through it at a macro level. Just reminding ourselves consistently of our purpose, of our desire to have working regional councils, not to get stuck on our own stuff or our own perceptions, but again to listen to what we'd heard. And we were very fortunate because we had a ton of really good wisdom. There was a lot of good thinking around this, and that really helped us.
Mhm. And I mean, offer gratitude and thanks to the 9 of you who are volunteers in the church, going about this work as volunteers called to help the church navigate in this time of transition and transformation. So thanks to you and the other 8 members who I can only imagine have given and continue to give a lot of time and energy to this.
Well, it was interesting because most people said that when they had been elected to this, that they were given commiserations.
Hmm.
And we found it not to be a particularly stressful piece of work, but a really gratifying piece of work. And we really worked well together. We appreciated the wisdom that we all brought to the table, and our willingness to think about the ministry of the whole church.
Right. So we are at about 1:45. So we have a few more questions coming in. I understand that the question from the consistoire is coming. And also question regarding your commission's receiving of feedback going forward, and kind of, I guess, going back to the question I asked you at the beginning, which is, okay, your mandate was the number of regions and the boundaries of those. How do you do that outside from considerations of finance and staffing? So this question is saying, if the remit implementation group takes this information and comes back saying 17 is not financially viable, what does that look like? Or is that part of the consideration?
So, what the short answer is no, in the sense that the way that our process was set up is that the implementation team will deal with whatever our decisions were. So it's not that one is financially not viable and another model might be. It's that it's the same amount of money.
Yeah.
Might be stretched in different directions. It might mean that staffing looks different, and so on. There might be 17 regions, but the work is the same. Mm-hmm. If there was 36 or if there was 13, the work and ministry of those regions is exactly the same. Yeah. And so really it's the mechanics of it, not so much the finances. The implementation teams knows how much money we have to do this, and they'll make it work with the money we have.
And they'll take the insight that your group has brought based on extensive consultation and really faithful discernment, hearing from the church, and then be able to provide something that could make that work.
Absolutely. And again, I mean, it amazes me still that people across the church have not, many people at least, have not fully understood the immense change we're moving into. This is not going to look the same. Mm-hmm. And the regions aren't going to look the same. The staffing is not going to look the same. This is a different church that we're moving into. Now, again, some of us are optimistic about this. And that it's going to be a refreshing way of doing things, that it'll alleviate some burden that we have on human resources in our pastoral churches and allow us a lot of new freedoms.
Yeah, and that feeds into a couple of questions coming in about kind of new ways of doing things. So this question specifically about changing meeting styles, the integration of virtual meetings, saying how do we need to change the way of doing things? And I think, you've talked about the scope of the change, and I think part of what will emerge is that there will need to be a change in how we do things, and that based on kind of the considerations that your group has heard and the recommendations regarding regions, that might look very different in different parts of the church and different parts of the country.
Absolutely. No one should assume that we're going to just pick up under a different name the work that we've been always doing.
Yeah.
We're going to do it differently.
Yeah, based
but hopefully better.
Yeah. Wonderful. The question that we've been waiting on is regarding a specific parish or pastoral charge. How can St. Mark pastoral charge become part of Quebec region if it so wishes? And I think, this is where I'm going to return back to our details regarding steps going forward providing feedback, and I see we have a few more questions coming in about that. So Steve, if we could get back up the slide with the email addresses. So general comments, anything that we haven't been able to touch upon today, or any other feedback, comments, questions that emerged for you coming out of this conversation, coming out of the many steps in this process going forward, those can be sent to remits@united-church.ca. Any questions we haven't got to today, please send those there, and a response will absolutely be sent. And then in terms of specific requests for changes from what has been proposed by the Boundaries Commission, specific change recommendations, those can be sent to reg change, CHANGE, at united-church.ca, and both those email addresses are currently up on the screen. And just to, again, emphasize and highlight that those changes need to come from a motion of a church pastoral charge board, a presbytery, or conference executive. So a question regarding, can an individual send a request for a change from what's recommended in the report? No, that needs to come from a pastoral charge board, a motion from a board, or from a presbytery or conference executive. So if you're someone who would like to see a change, you need to find a group of people to work with to go about putting together a motion from a church body to put a recommendation forward. And then the deadline for that is January 31st for getting all those comments in. So I think we have hopefully there's been a great variety of questions coming in today. I want to thank everyone who has participated. It's been such a rich time to have a chance to talk about specific questions and also some broader scope things. And I really want to thank you, Andrew, for taking the time to be with us today, for dedicating so much time and energy to this task, for leading the Boundaries Commission so faithfully, and to the members of your commission. So thank you, everyone. And we look forward to seeing as the church continues to go about this exciting time of change, how we continue to navigate forward together. Thanks so much.